And that is not real change. That is not going to improve our economy, Mr. Chair.
Honourable David Parker.
Mr. Chairman, I want to refer to clause 137 of the bill, which changes the way in which the revenue gathers more tax in respect of late payments. Now, currently, Mr. Chairman, when someone doesn't pay an account on time and the person to whom the money is owed adds a late payment charge, then that doesn't incur GST, because it's in the nature of an interest payment. It's effectively a late payment fee, which is a little bit like interest. And so the predominant view within the accounting community has been that that isn't a taxable good or service, it's a financial service that is zero rated for GST purposes. Now, clause 137 changes that, and it says that for the first time the revenue is going to be pinging the late payment fee and saying, oh, that's a GST-able activity. Now, this is going to be causing all sorts of complexity for people in business. All of a sudden, those, not as much as GST off fresh fruit and vegetables. Well, actually, I think you might be wrong there, because I would think that the incidence and the irregularity of this will be far more pervasive than GST off fresh fruit and vegetables, which would have affected supermarkets in the main. But in any event, let's return to the point here. If that was wrong, two wrongs don't make a right. So, Mr. Goldsmith, introducing further complexity into the tax code is rubbish. We're increasing complexity and compliance costs here because, you know, if you had a $20 account, well, let's say it's a $100 account, and there's a 2% fee for paying it late, that's $2. Now, do you know, every one of those people that collects that extra $2 is now going to have to adjust their future tax return and include GST on the $2 financial penalty that they're charging for someone paying their account late. And every person that pays the extra $2, in theory, if they're GST registered, and some of the people in the gallery will understand this point, even if the National Party people on the other side don't, every person who's GST registered who pays $2 late payment fee, in theory, is going to be able to claim a GST input credit in respect of that $2 payment. What a nonsense. This is not a good or service. That is a charge being made for late payment, which is tantamount to an interest payment, and in fact it often calls it that. Now, what did we hear in submissions? We had the accounting fraternity coming along and saying this was wrong in principle. The accountants came along and said, what's this government up to? This looks like a tax grab, because it's not grounded in the principles that underline the Tax Act, the GST Act, which is that financial services are not GST-able. So the government is ignoring that basic prohibition on charging GST on financial services and saying in respect of the late payment fee that you effectively charged in lieu of interest for paying an account late, they call it a penalty fee, but it is essentially an interest charge. That interest charge is now GST-able. Where is the principle, Minister? Stand up and defend that principle. Stand up and explain why that is wrong or why it is right. Mr. Chairman, the accountants said it breaches the principles that underlie the GST Act. Why is it that we are proceeding with clause 137 of this bill, which not only breaches that principle, it's going to increase the compliance costs of businesses, because they will have to be accounting for that little penalty as a GST-able supply, and if they're paying it, they're going to have a separate transaction which claims back the GST in a way which they can't do for interest.
What about early payment discounts?
That's interesting. Early payment discounts I'm not sure, Mr. Clark. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. But I think we should get the minister to address that question as well, Mr. Chairman, Clause 137, which sits in this Part 4 of the Act, is of this effect. It says, for the purposes of this Act, an amount charged, Mr Chairman...
David Parker.
It says, and I'm just reading out the relevant clauses, for the purpose of this Act, an amount charged for the late payment of account is treated as being consideration for a supply of services in the course of or furtherance of a taxable activity, whether the amount is described as a fee, penalty or other charge. So it might be interest, it might be called interest, it might in fact be a late payment charge that is tantamount to interest. Both the supplier and the purchaser may agree that that is the reality of the transaction, but this legislation says no, black is white. It says that it might be that in reality, but it's going to deem it to be otherwise. Deem it to be otherwise. There is no principle that lies behind this particular clause in the bill, and Mr Chairman, I want the Minister and the Chair to stand up and explain why it is that the accountants are wrong and the government thinks it's right. Mr Speaker, why is it that what is essentially an interest charge, which should not attract GST, why is that being deemed to be a supply of goods or services when in actual fact it's a late payment penalty tantamount to interest? Mr Speaker, if it was a late payment tantamount to interest, it should either be zero rated or it should be one way or the other outside the GST consequences of this provision. So, Mr Chairman, if we look at some of the other provisions in respect of Clause 4, there are some other areas that I would like clarification on in respect of the zero rating of goods. There's a new Clause 8D that is inserted that says, for the purpose of the zero rating of land rules, a supply that is an assignment or surrender of an interest in land is chargeable at tax of 0%, but it's not if this supply is made periodically. Now, we also had submissions about this, about what this is going to do in terms of the effect on the cost of rent-to-buy options. This is going to drive up the cost of low-cost housing, and the examples where people are getting an option to buy, which if they exercise, then they can credit towards some of their purchase price under their purchase contract, some of the payments that they have made as a tenant in the meantime. And we had property developers saying that this change in provision here is going to increase the cost of housing, because irrespective of whether the option is exercised, they're going to have to pay GST on the transaction before it's exercised. So it might not be clear that they may never exercise this option, but the developer, because they have the potential to be collecting or to be crediting some of their rental payments towards the purchase price, if the option is exercised, they're being deemed to be making a supply before the option is exercised. And these submitters came along and pointed out that this is going to considerably increase the cost of their subdivisions. And from memory, the developer who was giving us this advice was from the Minister and the Chair's electorate, so he might be interested in this. And they were saying that this was going to increase their effective cost, despite the fact that the option might not be exercised. The effect of this is that because they have to return GST at the start, they have the carrying cost of that GST payment that's returned to the government. They then have to reflect that cost on to the person who may exercise the option or may not under the rent-to-buy scheme. That increases the effective cost to the developer. Therefore, that cost is passed on to the low-income purchaser, which is therefore increasing the cost of housing in New Zealand. So another unprincipled amendment, as I understand it, according to the submission that we had to Select Committee, that I would like the Minister to explain. The more important one of them, with respect in terms of the number of people affected, is this penalty payment, which is now being deemed to be a GST-able supply rather than an interest penalty, and I would like to hear from the Minister as to what justification there is from departing from the underlying philosophy of the original GST Act, which is that financial services are zero rated or don't attract GST.
The Honourable Clayton Cosgrave.
Mr. Chair, I want to pick up where my